The rate of snow melt is accelerating, and the mountains that were once snow-covered now lack this distinctive feature. The narrow grazing area for yachts and motorship have forced locals to sell their livestocks, weakening their financial status. Health, education, and access to drinking water have become challenging, compelling migration. After John is demotivated, villages from Haji and Hill are also considering migrating. The ancient Rinchini monastery, dating back 400 years, stands at the center of the village, with a looming boulder behind it because of the landslide. As temperature increases during the summer along with the monsoon, snow melts in the mountains, feeding water into the glacier lake. The overflow from the glacier lake results in downstream flow and landslide across the village. They have also had problems with avalanches during winter and have lost several livestock taken by the snow. Lady Valley, a community of Nama people, owns the rich and historical culture. The ongoing migration poses a significant threat to this cultural heritage, if not stop. As we concluded our Bula visit, we took town and every citizen of our village appealing to protect the settlement in here. We convey the same voices of the people from Lily Valley to everyone, who now often wonder why we are being punished for the crime which we never committed.
climate-induced migration. The evidence through the video itself explain what is the potential risk that Nepal and the mountain countries facing in the face of the risk that the mountain countries facing, and how communities, those who are facing such risk, are forced to migrate to the urban center. So that is the evidence we have. Okay. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, has projected worse fire, longer drought, and increasing number of floods in the future. With these types of weather events frequently leading to mass displacement, the number of people migrating due to climate change is expected to rise substantially in the coming years. The World Bank estimates that climate change will create 40 million in South Asia, up to 86 million migrants in sub-Saharan Africa, and 17 million in Latin America, leading to 143 million climate migrants by 2050. Population displacement on this large scale leads to resource pressure on the towns, countries, and communities receiving migrants, and exacerbate existing instabilities, resource conflict, and disturbed social harmony. Nepal, one of the most climate vulnerable countries, has also been facing the impact of internal and external migration. With this context, I would like to invite our panelists who could share their learning, their knowledge, and also comment on the climate-induced migration, how it impacts in their region, in their working areas, and of course, how the international communities that are assembling in Dubai, what does it mean for those communities who are suffering from the risk. Well, so with this, I would like to invite Colin McSteen, the head of climate and resilience of Practical Action. Colin has over 30 years of experience in sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Colin has been following the UNFCCC Conference of Parties since 2014 and is an observer of the UNFCCC Warsaw International Mechanisms for Loss and Damage, and has been engaged in the development of the Santiago Network as well as the establishment of Loss and Damage Fund. Colin, please take a seat. Next. I would like to invite David. David, the Chief of Climate Officer, Mercy Corps. David Nicholson is Mercy Corps Chief Climate Officer. In the role, he is responsible for overseeing all aspects of Mercy Corps commitment to climate change as a centerpiece of the new 10 years strategy they have developed. During his 11 years plus experience in Mercy Corps to the date, David has built and lead climate and environment technical support unit and played a key role in the growing climate resilience program portfolio. David lead the initiative to reform Mercy Corps technical support unit operating model during his time as acting vice president from 2021-22, and David is also here with us. David, sit here. And then I also like to invite Kirti Shrestha, the climate advisor working in Dhan Church. Kirti has over 14 years of professional experience in climate and resilience, having extensive knowledge of climate change issues, adaptation needs, loss and damage, and mitigation areas. And she is the author of Climate-Induced Migration. Very recently, she has published one paper as well. She has worked closely to develop various national and subnational policies in climate change and resilience development. Of course, she has worked with various international agencies as well. In this backstop, in the first round, I would like to take an opportunity to get your first reaction on the videos. I start from Colin.
Thank you, Dharam. I think the video poses some interesting questions. First of all, clearly the environment in those villages is changing. Snow melt is changing. Glaciers are retreating. Temperatures are changing. There was a paper published in Nature only today that indicates that although global warming is actually heating the high Himalayas, that actually beneath the glaciers we're actually getting areas of colder temperature. However, that is influencing higher atmospheric temperatures that's leading to less precipitation. So the glaciers themselves are actually retreating. However, looking at those communities and the harsh landscape in which they live, I think climate change is one factor in the cause of migration. I think clearly when you are living in an environment that is so fragile, and you have the option of migrating to a city nearby where you can get a daily wage working in a factory or cleaning a house, then maybe there is an economic driver involved as well. However, those communities do have agricultural land, they do have fresh water, they obviously have potentials of their own which are not being used. For example, their tourism potential. So I think it's oversimplification blaming it purely on climate change, but I think climate change combined with other drivers of change clearly are having a negative impact on those three communities, and if something doesn't change soon, we're going to have three communities that no longer exist with all of the migrants living somewhere else. I think what is interesting is the people still value their houses because those houses are not derelict, they're locking them, and they're probably coming back for family, social, religious purposes regularly throughout the year. So I think it's a complex picture and one that we need to better understand. Thank you.
Well, before I go to David, we have Honorable Parliamentarian Ramesh Singh Raimaji. I would like to request Ramesh Singh Raimaji to take the chair as a chair of this session. Please. So David, now your turn.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all, and thank you for the video. It was, many elements of climate change. We read statistics and graphs and think about policies, but we don't often focus on the human stories. And I think these videos and these focus on particular communities are powerful. So thank you for sharing that. I want to echo everything that Colin said. I think is really wise. And migration is such a complex concept. Mercy Corps works in 42 countries globally. And as we seek for building resilient communities, we see migration as a factor and a function of any community that can be healthy, right? People leave to go other places for a whole wide variety of reasons. And wanting to understand that and see when is that a positive adaptation and when that is a maladaptation is such a fundamental piece of this equation. When I see stories like this with specific communities and as Colin says, the harsh environment and the changes that we hear from people there they're experiencing are very real. It suggests that these communities have not had the benefit of, support for adaptation. There has not been sufficient ability to adjust livelihoods, expectations, awareness, all the things that are necessary for an adaptation process that might convince some people to stay, might motivate, incentivize people to stay. So that's an interesting thing to explore more.
Kirti, if you have any quick reaction.
Yes, echoing both what Colin and David said, I did starkly see the gendered impacts, and also what struck me the most was that the community were not used to with the word climate change or Jalvayu Parivartan, as we call in Nepali, but they were facing it every day of their lives. So I think this is something that we as practitioners, as policymakers, need to understand that communities are facing, they have perceptions, but they do not know the technicalities of it. So that is something that we have to deal with, and I think, yeah, that would be all.
Thanks. So, Colin, considering these impacts that we have observed, what are the connections, both economic and non-economic loss and damages, and how can global policy help to address those challenges?
Thank you. Well, the climate negotiations have been going on for a number of years, and I think the shift in the negotiations from an annual meeting to discuss greenhouse gas mitigation to an annual meeting that talks about greenhouse gas mitigation and what we can do to support communities who are already facing the consequences of climate change. So the issue of adaptation has risen, and then in the last decade the reality that for many communities and many ecosystems it's already too late, and we need to be thinking about loss and damage. So at this COP it was particularly historic that on day one there was the agreement to establish the Loss and Damage Fund, and then today there was the finalisation of or the operationalisation of the Santiago network for loss and damage, which is very much mandated to provide technical assistance to countries and communities who are facing the irreversible impacts of climate change. So we've now got the institutional landscape, we have the executive body, the Water International Mechanism, we have the fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, we have the operational entity, the Santiago network, to actually start to be able to do something to support communities on the front line. I think my only qualification of that is the scale and the pace at which we're moving is inadequate to respond to the sorts of challenges that we saw in the video. So we now have the international architecture to actually start to help. Whether or not we can act at the scale and the pace necessary, I think we'll wait and see, but at the moment it's not looking promising. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Colin. So, David, what does climate actions look like in more fragile environments as we see? And then what can development agencies do to support those communities who are facing such challenges?
So when we look at these, we use this word fragile, and I think that's probably could be perceived as quite condescending, but and it's a word that we use, but I think what we mean by that is in places in the world that already have a lot, forget climate change, already have a lot of development challenges. These challenges existed before and were already really complex. So trying to think about how to support communities like that with adaptation and to build resilience to this new layer of threat adds a whole lot of extra complexity. So it actually becomes, as you get closer and closer to these communities and closer to the work, good climate adaptation work and good sustainable development starts to look very similar. There are certain things that you have to have at the foundational level in order for communities to adapt. We need reasonably robust livelihood opportunities, right? These need to be diverse, particularly when you come to climate change. People need to have a range of diverse. We need strong governance. We know really well that we need good progress on gender equity. We've seen communities manage risk better when gender roles are more equal. So there's certain things that are sort of foundational development requirements that whether it's development money or whether it's climate change money, should be supporting communities to build. But that's not, that alone is the foundation. And then we look at what communities need to adapt. There's been a tendency to think of communities in isolation. We use this unit of communities as if it's an easy thing to sort of, that's a unit that we can operate within. But communities can't be left on their own to adapt. No matter what resources they get, they're part of a larger system of policies and markets that have to adapt to this challenge as well. What we've seen in lots of places that we work that fit this sort of definition of fragile, we work in places like in Sub-Saharan Africa, in DRC, or in Somalia, or in places like Yemen, or places where these development indicators are very low, and there's a tendency to forget you really have to manage these challenges at multiple scales, strengthening governance systems not only at the community but at the subnational, making sure there's support from national government, making sure that market systems are able to serve those environments. All of these things have to be done together. So to your question on what the development agencies need to do, well, there's a couple things we really need to be better at. One is we have to make sure that we're thinking coherently for longer time horizons. This tendency to do small projects that last 2-3 years is just not good enough. And sometimes that's enforced because that's the money we get, but we should be better at thinking longer term even if the money is short. We also then need to be advocating to the funders, whether it's governments, whether it's philanthropic providers, to support longer term so that these projects can be implemented in more successful ways.
Thanks. So, as a development practice, you have been working and you are supporting the community. How big is the problem? How big is the issue of migration in Nepal? And how do you analyze this?
Yes, well, migration, if you look at the lowland communities in these Sudur Pashchim provinces, migration is a natural part and parcel of their livelihood. Seasonal migration. People have been traveling during non-agricultural seasons to India and other countries, and they have been coming back during the agricultural season. This has been happening. With globalization, the economic pool has been very strong. But if you look at the environmental factors, water has been playing a key role throughout the Nepal, even in high Himalayas, in mid-hills, in lowlands of Nepal. In Himalayas, the glacier changes, glacier melting, the rocks. I mean, we saw the documentary, right? We saw the documentary. And the dry season during other times, that has been the push factors, whereas in the mid-hills, it is the hazards like landslides, and then the drought that has been landing, the lessening agricultural productivity, those kind of things. And if you go to the lowlands, it has been the floods. It has been the floods, it has been the drought again. Everything has been around the water. And with my experiences, when you look at the particular communities in Kailali, if you look at the Fata communities, there have been a whole village which has been relocated post-floods because their lands have been taken away by the rivers, monsoon rivers, and they have relocated to other areas. And within those communities also, men of the communities, they have an easier choice to migrate. And they bring in money, and it is not only a problem, but I also see it as a solution. I mean, that is something that we discussed in the paper as well. Migration can bring in remittances that can help households and communities adapt. They can opt for climate smart agriculture. They can opt for, more adaptive technologies with the money. So that is there. But if you look at the women of the households, you see the increase in their daily chores, like responsibilities, right? They are forced to handle their farmlands as well as their houses. So those kind of differentiated impacts can be seen. And it is not easier for women of those communities to migrate, to go outside and earn because of the social responsibilities that they have. So those are the various kinds of impacts. And if you go to these villages and communities, the men are not there. The men are largely absent. And the whole responsibility of household and the agriculture falls on the women. And there are senior citizens, but men are largely absent from the households. And with migration, when the family starts earning, they tend to shift to urban centers. They tend to leave their agricultural land fallow. And that is another impact that we're seeing that will have a long-lasting impact in the economy. Yes.
Thanks. So I just come back to Colin. Economic and non-economic loss and damage is one of the pertinent issues that has been under discussion elsewhere. So the migration, that has a severe impact on non-economic loss and damage. So as a climate practitioner, long experience in this area, what do you suggest? What are the needed required to adapt those or to protect those communities, to protect those risk-averse communities from the impact of climate change in the context particularly when adaptation, discussion or negotiation failed in COP28? Colin, over to you.
Thank you. I think I think the key for me is it's not about what we do, but it's about creating the right enabling environment so that people get the support that they need. So I would argue that migration is both an economic and a non-economic loss and damage. It's economic because people are having to move and they may be having to shift livelihoods. They're going from maybe a purely agricultural livelihood to a service-based livelihood. So they'll need retraining. So there are costs inherent in that. Of course, there's the movement required. But of course, there's the non-economic loss about losing connection to the place where you grew up, to friends and family, and of course, the social implications that Kriti has just mentioned. So, you know, it's a composite of both economic and non-economic costs. However, having a loss and damage fund, having the access to financing to be able to support those communities is important, and it's not just the case that it needs to compensate them for the economic losses. It can also compensate them for the non-economic losses. And the example that I would give is somebody who is suffering psychologically as a result of being forced to migrate. They can use the compensation they receive to get psychological counselling. And that's the sort of assistance that's needed for people who are being forced to move. I think the best example I can give from Practical Action's work is in Bangladesh, approximately 2,000 people every day arrive in Dhaka bus station having migrated from their homelands, whether that's inland as a result of floods or droughts or whether it's from the coast as a result of loss of livelihoods. They're arriving in Dhaka, the capital city, and they're living in informal settlements and they're looking for informal labour. Now, if those people were trained, there is a potential economic opportunity, and you know, we would be seeing opportunity as a result of that mobilisation of people. So it's very important to not just think about economic losses, non-economic losses, but they can be compensated using economic resources. Thank you.
Thanks. David, so you have been working in different parts of the world, and this is the humanitarian crisis as well. So what's your lesson learned in supporting communities around the globe, particularly climate-induced migration?
Okay, there we go. That's adaptive management there, guys. So Mercy Corps has been working trying to understand the dynamics around migration in many parts of the world, and because there's many different sorts of migration, right? There's migration that would occur with a more acute shock, a large flash flood, a hurricane or something like that. Some of that would fall under the sort of loss and damage category because people might leave and never come back. There's migration that occurs for more slow onset, worsening conditions for agriculture, ongoing drought conditions. Sometimes people migrate seasonally, and sometimes they go and don't come back. So there's lots of dynamics for us to consider. And I think we've been trying to learn about that in some places to see where migration, if managed appropriately and safely, can be a positive adaptation, where it's seasonal and it's done in a way that doesn't lead to the devastation of certain communities. Just a couple of quick examples where I've been trying to understand these dynamics and share with you. One is in Guatemala, where you know, the Caribbean coast of Guatemala is very susceptible to hurricanes. These are getting stronger, these are getting more frequent, and we're seeing quite a lot of migration heading north towards the United States from there. Lots of that migration is very unsafe. So we've been trying to work with communities to understand, you know, what are the decision triggers to migrate, and for those who don't really want to but being forced to, what could be done to enable them to stay. One major factor we realized was you know, having money up front before a hurricane to prepare their assets, protect their assets, maybe move themselves in a way that can get out of the way of the storm but can move back, has helped change the decision dynamics. So we've worked with a remittance company, because a lot of money goes to Guatemala from remittances. We work to incentivize people to send money. We use trigger warnings for hurricanes. We incentivize small cash from Mercy Corps to get people to send remittances prior to the hurricane rather than after, which enabled people to prepare properly and led to fewer people deciding to migrate after the impact of the storm. It's quite a small pilot, about 5,000 households we work with, but these things are really promising, right? That's a positive adaptation that we can work with to see how can you use financial mechanisms to change the equation on decisions to migrate for those who really don't want to. We're working in the Sahel also, where we've been seeing these drought cycles have gone on, and a similar story to my colleague here was described in Nepal. A lot of the men will cross country, go to neighboring countries, go to seas to find work. Incredibly unsafe. So we've been trying to work with to say, okay, when a decision to migrate is being made and that is an adaptation that actually is useful because there is the potential to find money and bring it back to the communities, how can we ensure that people have the right identification, they have safe passage, and they have communication ability to stay in touch with their families so they're not subject to, frankly, scams that are out there that make people very unsafe and take away a lot of the money that's being transferred. So these are the sorts of things we've been trying to grapple with, which require a complex understanding of what's driving migration.
Yes. So looking into the David's and Collins' perspective, climate change impact need to be analyzed from intersectionality of gender, indigenous communities, cultural impact that we have witnessed. How do you analyze those intersectionality as a,
Yes.
how climate change affect those intersectionality and how does that actually means for Los Angeles?
Thank you, sir. I think we have already discussed to a certain extent the gendered impacts of migration of climate change, right? So if you look, there's a data done by a study that says that out of the most migration done in the Himalayan region, Himalayan and mid-hill region, most of the migrants were from Dalit communities. So you can see the stark, because they have less land ownership. So when the agriculture fails, they are more vulnerable. They have to migrate to earn, right? So that is what you see. And you also see the increasing rates of migration from the indigenous communities. So those are happening. There is a data to prove that, right? So you do see the differential impact in terms of land holding, in terms of their ability to cope, right, with the stress and the shocks, so they have to impact. So you see the caste-based and the indigenous discrimination there. Gender discrimination is also there. And also, when the family or the individual is planning to migrate, how much access to safe information, like something like you just said, right? How much access to safe information, to correct information do these households have? There also you see a discrepancies. For example, in an individual, more so a female individual from Dalit community is bound to have less access to safe migration informations. She is less likely to have access to the government-led, all the protocols, all the safety measures than an upper-class male migrant. So that discrepancy is also there. How safe is the migration? You see, it is unsafe for the marginalized. So that is also there. I'd like to stop there.
So I'll back to Colin again. So Colin, one of the success of COP28 is the establishment of rollout of Los Angeles. And you heard the responsibility, the impact on climate change in different sections of society. So does the long-awaited Los Angeles Fund continue to reduce such crises in the mountain or mountain communities?
No, and it shouldn't, because that's the role of adaptation. And we know in the negotiations at the moment that adaptation is the area where there is the least agreement and challenging progress. Why the challenges around the adaptation process are really about the resourcing, the means of implementation that is essential to enable adaptation to take place. What the Loss and Damage Fund is primarily for is to rehabilitate livelihoods and lives. And therefore, for Nepal to be prepared to access the Loss and Damage Fund, there are a few things that the country can start thinking about now. The first one is, which are the critical sectors that are most impacted by irreversible or unavoided climate impacts? Water, health, education, infrastructure. Where are the biggest impacts occurring sectorally in Nepal from climate change that cannot really be adapted to? And then undertaking a needs assessment to actually quantify what would be the assistance that would be needed to compensate for the existing losses and the predicted losses. And it's important to bear in mind that the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalised on day one. We heard several governments step up and offer money to pay into that fund, but we still do not have the rules and regulations for how that fund is going to be dispersed. That doesn't mean, I think, for countries to wait for the guidelines to be developed. You can already start to think about, well, we need assistance in these sectors, in these areas, and we will access the Loss and Damage Fund to compensate for those areas. So it's not a case of waiting, it's a case of being ready, so that once the Loss and Damage Fund is finally ready to start dispersing money, that you can get the money for those critical sectors in Nepal that are impacted by climate change. Thank you.
Great, Colin. So David, as Colin mentioned, different enabling environment is really important. So what policy factors, what enabling environment is really important to consider to address climate-induced migration?
Yeah, I mean, there's such a wide range of potential policy levers for this issue, and I think at the national level, the important thing I would emphasize is, Colin rightly said this is largely an adaptation challenge, and we're waiting and hoping to see more robust agreements, much more finance for adaptation. But there are policy things that national governments should be doing right now to recognize that, migration is an inevitable part of the climate change impacts. People will be moving, and there's various policy solutions that can be rolled out to either support those people who don't want to move, with the right sort of social services, health services, those things where possible, but also to support migrants to make sure they're safe. And I think I don't know if this is true of Nepal, but I think a lot of countries, and if you read, national adaptation plans, there's not a whole lot in there that recognizes and sort of honestly admits, because migration is political often, right? Doesn't honestly admit that people will be moving, and this is how we will be supporting them as a government to ensure that it's as safe as possible, and it's a positive choice, not a negative choice.
Great. So as David mentioned, what are the policy enabling environment? We have the parliamentarian,
Yes.
we have the representative from the local government, parliament. So what enabling environment they should bring at federal level, local level and provincial level
Yes.
to address, to avert and to minimize the impact of loss and damage and impact of climate change on those communities, what they should do.
Yes, I think the first would be the mitigating the impacts. I mean, you would try to put the community where they are, create enabling environment so that the community can live with less risk and be able to adapt to the impacts so that they don't have to move at all. The first would be that. The first would be ascertaining that there is enough mitigation and adaptation in place. Now, when the community is forced to migrate, then I echo what David also just said, have enough safety measures to the destination where they are going, ensure that the communities have access to social safety nets, they have access to disaster, risk information where they are going. What we have to keep in mind is if the community is moving from one hazard areas and moving to another location, let's make sure that the community is moving to a safer location and not into a bigger hazard area. That is something. I think there was a study with the Dalit communities. They moved to Tarai to escape the landslide-related hazard, and they settled in the banks of Karnali River, where they were facing flood-related hazards. I mean, this is a fact that the Dalit communities in the Tarai region have been facing. So we have to ensure that this does not repeat or happen to other communities, because one family, few generations apart, losing all their lands, to first landslide, then you come to Tarai, and then you lose your land to the flood erosions. So that is not fair, and it costs a lot of it entails a lot of non-economic losses and damages there. So, those kind of assertions have to be made in place. And also, I think when you're talking about accepting adaptation, try to make this destination more safer, try to make the migration process more inclusive, have good policies that support gendered discrepancies when it comes to migration, have those in place. So those are some things that the federal as well as most importantly the local government can monitor, give them the right information, right knowledge, right access to the communities, irrespective of their caste, gender, make sure that the communities, the individuals have access to those informations. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So climate-induced migration is one of the issues that coming up. Flood, landslide, drought, heat wave, cold wave, thunderstorm, all those are forcing communities to migrate from one place to other place. So policy enabling environment is really important, really crucial to address those challenges. So we have the parliamentarian with us. So I'd like to request Honorable Ramesh Raimaji to deliver his thought and close this discussion. Before that, Krishna, she has some souvenirs for our panelists. So I request Honorable Parliamentarian to deliver his speech first, and then we'll hand over the souvenirs to our panelists. Any questions? Well, so please.
I'm Priyanka. I am a student. I study anthropology and sociology, and so I kind of want to take that lens into asking this question to all of you. Is kind of, this whole time being at COP and thinking about climate impact through the lens of 1.5 degrees centigrade, or trying to even think about mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage. I think it's a lot of conversations around what a permissible level of harm is for communities and what that looks like. And I think even when we talk about intangible losses that occur, I feel like a lot of what gets lost within that context is a discussion about how do we account for things like loss of culture. Like, you move a community to a safer location, but it's probably a community that's always been marginalized. How do you account for those kinds of losses that occur? And within a framework that is very techno-scientific, how do we even speak within this language or ensure that rights are kind of, participatory and like better provided for, both within the framework of development aid organizations, but also the government. So I would love to hear from all of you.
Thanks. Question is very clear. So just a quick reaction because of the limit of time. Anyone like?
I mean, it's a really good question. As an ecologist by training, evolution happens, change happens. I think the key is that we need to make sure we don't do it in a way that harms, and that we record what we can. I think the realization that we've lost so much cultural heritage, not as a result purely of climate change, but of other social drivers within society, that really what we need to do is make sure that we do no harm, and that we try and explore what a positive outcome can look like. I mean, as somebody from the United Kingdom, the issue of decolonialisation is a critical issue that we're struggling with, because as a former global empire, we can't just claim our carbon emissions based upon the islands of the United Kingdom. We have to look at the benefits that we reaped from the colonies around the world and the massive number of people who were directly contributing to that. Now, that's not a popular topic of discussion back home, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. So, yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. We need more anthropologists involved in the negotiations, and we'd probably get more satisfactory outcomes if we did. Too many economists and too many business leaders and not enough social scientists, anthropologists. Thank you.
Great. So you can contact them bilaterally. Thank you very much. So I hand over the mic to our honorable.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and the respected delegation, as we draw the current on our conference here in the Nepal Pavilion at COP28, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to to each and every one of you for your extremely useful contribution and the delegation for the guiding the critical issues which the most of the people in the Himalayas are facing. Throughout the meetings, we have reached into the severe reality what the melting snow caps pose forthcoming threat to the water resources. This unsettled situation is very risky for the structure of the ecosystem. Himalayas, but it directly affects the livelihoods of the communities what depends on these resources for their nourishment. The increase in the magnification of research climate change cannot be ignored. People of Himalayas are facing very hard time. What way to do life are under threat by the climate change, forcing them to find a new place for their safe and easy life, easy living. Yes, climate is changing in not for the ways changes, but on urgent duty. The meeting held here comes out there with the understanding that every nation, despite of its great of geographical location, plays a vital role in the collective effort to combat climate change. We were able to identify and be aware of what climate change can result from the Himalayas to the global, which can give a brief statement as in light of the derives conclusions, we must turn our agents to practical solution. The need for the financial support cannot be overstated. However, it's imperial. We must advocate for the disbursement of funds in support adaptation measures at the local level. These funds are not only invested. Despite there will be a support system for the communities. In additional, the media play one important role in the bringing the voice of the grassroots community in collection and data. In closing, sincerity, thanks all of you for your passions and the commitment to the cause. May your efforts Yet COP28 mark a turning point in our fight in opposition to climate change, expecting and ensuring more sectoral future for Nepal, the Himalaya, and the whole global community. Our, our actions today shape the future world. Thank you. Jai Nepal. Namaste.